Karen, it's great to see you again.
Good to see you too, Sevilla.
I've really enjoyed your latest conversations.
Oh, thank you. Well,
I mean, I
I
enjoy
always
all of
have
them.
fun with them too. So it's a privilege to be able to do this kind of stuff, hang out with interesting people.
Yeah. And your channel is just getting better and better,
Oh,
It's a really nice spot for these conversations. So, I guess I contacted you because there's two in particular that I really related to and enjoyed. And that was your talk with Glen about did he say boomerang? I don't know if he said boomerang theory or boomerang.
well, that was the title of the episode. Yeah, Boomerang Theory. It was the last one that we did. It was episode 6 in the What is Life series. Yeah.
And then with Mark Solms and his book, whose title I don't remember, but who was very interesting.
The Hidden Spring.
Yeah,
Journey
the Hidden Spring. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess there are quite a few questions I wanted to ask you, or maybe reflect with you about some of those. Getting my notes together. Some of those. Some of the points that came up, and the first one was Glen's the dialogue he had with Glen, which was really so interesting because I really related to it in a lot of ways. And the first thing that he said, I guess in a lot of ways, this is one of the most important points to me, was that he said that computation is fundamental. And because computation itself, I guess what he's saying is computation itself is a relationship.
Yes. Well, yeah, he says computation is more fundamental than more fundamental. I forgot the matrix now, but relationships are more fundamental than things.
Yeah, I mean and it was something like
computation is more fundamental than information.
Yeah.
So and relationships are more fundamental than things.
Fundamental than things, yeah. Specifically conditional relationships, which means that's when a choice needs to be made, and if else then choice needs to be made. And so that means choice means that outcome is not predetermined. And so that in order for an outcome, you have to I don't know how to describe it, the computation itself, or I'm having a little trouble with the word computation, so I'm stumbling.
Yes, well, so let me tell you what I think
Okay.
he's saying, because he has such a brilliant mind, and inside there, I know there's something super important, but words fail on my side. So, but let me tell you what I think he's saying. Well, for one thing, the if else then thing looks to me like it's a description of action and consequence. And one would think that that has to be what we think of as a living organism, right?
Yeah.
But one of the examples that he and I have played around with a lot is the idea of a lock and key. So the mechanism was obviously designed so that when the key is inserted into the lock, the tumblers can sense, we're using the word sense, but it's tumblers in a lock. The tumblers can sense whether or not the key is the correct shape. And if the key is the correct shape, the tumblers will allow the lock to open.
Right.
When the actor jams the key in the lock and turns it, the lock will open. But if you think about that process, it seems to me that, I mean, this is what goes on in my mind. I sent him a question about this, and he said it's going to take him a couple of weeks to think it through. So I only have the question, not the answer yet. But my question is, then couldn't we also say that mechanism is more fundamental than the result, and that conditions are more fundamental than I wrote this up as a matrix here. Conditions are, yeah, mechanism is more fundamental than the output, and conditions are more fundamental than the result.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And if that's true, then that means that, in a sense, the physical laws of the universe are the conditions under which the results happen. So those physical laws of the universe obviously have to be fundamental, because without, for example, gravity is what allowed or initiated the particles coming together into atoms, and the atoms coming together into planetary systems, and all of that stuff. There's a condition, and then there's a result. So there's some kind, even before there is what we call life, there has to be some kind of a lock and key mechanism where some condition produces some result. That's what I think. I think that's what he's talking about.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Maybe going beyond his.
Well, I think I think both of us have sort of, I guess what you would say, a visceral understanding of what he's talking about. Because what I think he means is very similar to yours, which is that, like you just said, it's action and then outcome. And it's that engagement. It's that engagement with the lock that where everything is. It's that relationship between lock and key. And then there is a choice to be made, or let's just say there's an engagement, and it either engages or it doesn't engage. And it's in that engagement, not engagement space that everything is. It's that relationship.
Well, it seems to be, it has to be that way, because it's in that engagement, not engagement space that things cohere into things.
Exactly.
Which is where the, I think a lot about boundaries, but the boundary is not imposed on the thing. The boundary arises because the thing has cohered.
Right.
Right. There's something central that's drawing to itself a certain something that make that become a thing.
Yeah, it turns it into a pattern. It turns it into something that is durable, let's just say.
Yeah.
To some extent, that has some staying power, that isn't, like, you couldn't say that this relationship itself has staying power. It is an event. It happens. And if it is successful, then exactly what you're saying, it coheres into something, a thing. And that can happen just about in any way that there's a relationship.
Well, one of the things I was thinking about when you asked that question was, I wrote down, how is a thing defined? And then
Good.
Yeah, how is a thing seen? When we see something, when we perceive something, how do we perceive it? And so thinking of it from the standpoint of an artist, one of the things I was taught in this creativity class, which it took me a long time to understand what he was talking about, because I interpreted initially through a different filter, but he said, you paint relationships, not things. I thought he was talking about, maybe if I have two figures on the square, I'm painting what that relationship looks like between the two figures on the square. And certainly at some level that's true. But what I'm really doing is I'm painting the relationship between this color and that color, the relationship between this dark and that light, the relationship between this shape and that shape. So it's all about the relationships. And the reason that's important is that if you paint the thing itself, you're going to get it wrong. Because when you try to observe and paint a thing, your left brain gets engaged and starts telling you, particulating that thing and telling you what that thing is and what it looks like. And the left brain does not function well on that level. The left brain will give you a very sad, sorry, partial, mechanical
Mhm.
view of that thing, and you lose all the life that's in it. But
That's
if you
right.
take the relationships, then the thing, even if it's a human face, is going to come out
Mhm.
far more like what it actually is, because the right brain is contemplating those relationships, and the right brain has a much better view of what that thing is.
Mhm. Well, I suspect you don't even have to, when you say that, you can just kind of put that in your brain and forget about it because I mean, in theory, that makes all the sense in the world, but when you're actually doing it, I suspect that you're not thinking about relationships at all, that they just appear to you, that they just, they feel right. The relationships feel right. Is that the case?
Well, there's a yes and a no there. I years ago I used to sing, and one of the guys that was an accompanist for the work that I did was just an amazing pianist. And I asked him one time, I said, "You play so effortlessly. How did that happen?" And he said, "Well, 10,000 hours of discipline for one moment of freedom." And I think painting, for me,
Mhm.
painting was certainly like that, because painting did not come naturally to me. I was extremely awkward when I first started doing it. I didn't have any idea what I was doing. I was trying to represent what I thought I saw, and I was very left brain going about it, and
Mhm.
everything came out very awkward. But the more that I kept going over these elements and principles of design and really learning what they are and what they can do and how they all relate to each other, and color theory, and the theory of dynamics and rhythm and balance and all of those kinds of things, and I kept painting, painting, painting. And so at first I'm thinking about all those things,
Mhm.
but I'm also realizing there's too much thinking going on here. Because if you're processing all of these pieces of
Mhm.
stuff, you get completely overwhelmed and immobilized, and it just comes to a halt.
Mhm.
So then, after a time when I got more capable, let's say, I would start listening to lectures so that my left brain would get engaged and I wasn't able to think. And that would kind of release the implicit knowledge that I had gained over all that time of practicing with those things, so that the ones that were important to me, that came up into my salience field as I was working, would be more natural. And I didn't have to think about it so much. I
Mhm.
could get into the zone.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah, that makes sense. So there are things that you practice, let's just say, after all that time, and then it
yeah,
becomes integrated. So in
yes.
a way, there's what you were able to produce is both determined by your practice, by how much practice you've done, and by how much exposure you've had, and by what you've decided you like in terms of where you're going with painting, what types of subjects and colors you like to use and stuff like that. And then there's also this whole dynamic, free aspect to it that you've ingrained all these skills and talent. And then when you express them, it's a very free thing. That isn't, like you said, the flow state. That is where all the freedom is, where you're just intuitively creating these relationships as you go. So you've got this deterministic sort of thing, which is all the practice you've done, and then this free sort of thing, which is how it comes out on the canvas as you work,
And
not
then
even thinking.
you can stop once in a while, and then
Hmm.
you can assess.
Yeah, that's right.
It,
And then you go back into the other side of the brain, you could say, or into your area of practice, and draw from there what needs to refine it.
mhm.
But the actual expression is a very free thing and almost unconscious. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I would say. And then you go back and assess, and you look at it,
Mm-hmm.
and this is where I think these things come up in the assessment. I've said so many times, I think that there's something about the artistic process that just drills down through every level of reality.
That makes sense. That
Yeah,
makes a
and
lot of sense.
um, I used to think that it was the elements and principles of design, that matrix, that you would find that pattern everywhere, and you do, but that's not really what I see when I look at everything out there. What I'm really seeing is the artistic process itself has some connection to every level of reality. And one of those things that you do when you take stock of where you're at is context becomes very important. Like I might look at something and I think that is just, that's not showing up well enough because it's not light enough.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I really look at it, I realize, no, it's not that it's not light enough, it's that there's not enough contrast. So if I make the thing next to it darker, or if I make the thing next to it the opposite color,
Mm-hmm.
or if it's a warm color, if I make the thing next to it a cool color, and I create the difference, that's what's going to make it show up, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So you start to learn about context, and you start to learn about the importance of differences, and the importance of contrast, and well, a lot of those are principles of design, but it's there are the big overarching principles like boundaries, dominance, context that really show up everywhere. And part, to me, that seems kind of mysterious. Like, why would that be a part of everything in the universe?
Yeah, it certainly sounds like this design program is kind of reflects the metaphysics. You know, it's more of a reflection of the kind of metaphysical things that we keep looking at this corner. Like what are the commonalities that you could say apply or at least undergird every level? You know, and I think there's a couple of things you mentioned: the center, the relationship, the boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Now, so when you're looking at Persig, he has a different set of levels, right?
Yeah, I mean, and maybe we should go straight into Emergence, because that's what was so interesting to me about your conversation with Glen. I hadn't known much about Emergence at all. And then he was talking about it, and I was saying to myself, you know, this really sounds like Persig's levels. So I'll just talk about it briefly. In Persig's philosophy, the metaphysics of quality, you have 4 levels of evolution. And the first one is inorganic, which goes on for many billions of years. And everything on the planet is organic. Then something happens where carbon, this is what Persig said, that carbon becomes complex enough, the carbon molecules become complex enough that they somehow turn into this sort of latch, which is an interim between inorganic and biological. There's something that happens that it becomes sufficiently complicated that it latches off into that. And one principle underlying all these levels, by the way, or the evolution itself, is that anything in its level is always trying to overcome the laws of that level. So anything inorganic is always trying for more freedom, for more flexibility towards something better. You know, towards something better, I think, is key when you're looking at it in that, that's the lens to look at it through.
I saw that in your notes, and I could you said everything is always trying to overcome the laws of the level under it, or the level above it?
The level it's on. I mean, there's a little more to that. So the level above it, yeah, the lower levels are always trying to infiltrate, you know, or trying to take over the upper levels too. That happens in this theory as well. But you've got this inorganic level, and it becomes sufficiently complex that it can finally produce something like a protein. It has this dynamic center, which is the carbon, which is the carbon molecule, and it develops this ability to protect itself with this protective protein. And basically that's DNA. And it's DNA that then ratchets off and produces and begins to starts the biological level, which goes on for a long period of time, becomes more and more and more complex until the point, and Persig doesn't say what exactly happens. And I've been, you know, in discussions about this with other people, where what exactly happens that ratchets that off into the social level. But then the social level ratchets off, and that is its own thing. And then the intellectual comes from that. Eventually, human, you know, like human beings become less animal and more human, and they develop the capacity for intellect. You know, the brain develops to that level. So there's 4 levels. And each one of these levels, and you could say that, in fact, definitely these levels emerge from the other levels, and they emerge, and you cannot break one level down into the component parts of the level it emerged from. It's true strong emergence. In fact, profound strong emergence, because there's only 4 of these levels in this regard in his theory that have emerged with this kind of strength. And each level has its own laws and desires, you could say. And desire, I mean, thinking of it in those kind of anthropomorphic terms is relevant, I think, to Pirsig, because we're looking at it being a value-oriented metaphysics.
Okay, so how does he handle that in the inorganic level? That's so interesting.
Well, this is, you know, and I was listening to your conversation with Carl and Glen, so Pirsig would, I believe, and that it sounds right to me. I mean, this is why I like this philosophy so much, because, you know, when you find something you really like, it lines up with what you feel you already believed all along, if you know what I mean. You know, it just feels like it. So there is because value is what, you know, the relationships, this is a value-oriented metaphysics, value-centered metaphysics, relationships first, then instantiation of those relationships create the universe in Pirsig's model. And because everything has the capacity to overcome and to become more free and more flexible, you could say that even on the inorganic level, you could classify that as the inorganic form of consciousness. Because no matter how conscious or unconscious something is in the scientific, and the, you know, the way we think of consciousness, which is animals and above, I suppose, that drive towards freedom, towards quality, can be construed as consciousness no matter what is doing that.
So let me just confirm here. Everything has a drive towards more flexibility and more freedom.
Yeah.
Does he give any examples of what that looks like in the inorganic level?
Well, in the inorganic level, you have more and more, you know, chemical complexity. Things become.
So he associates chemical complexity with more flexibility and more freedom?
The more, yeah, that's what I mean. I'm not going to be able to talk about it in scientific terms because I don't know enough about it. But the more complex, for example, let's just say the more, like carbon molecules, I remember what he said about this. The more complex they are, the more able they are to do different things, and the more attributes they have. Like they can be harder, or you know, they can have different physical attributes. And I'm a little fuzzy there, so I better not go, you know, go into that too much more. But as things become more flexible, they have more attributes. You know, they can change state. And like I said, I better stop there because I don't know enough about
Well,
that.
I mean, that gives me
Yeah.
some idea of what he's talking about. That's really helpful.
Like the more complexity on the inorganic level, the more stuff they can do, to the point where they can do stuff like become a life form. And they use, you know, they use these forces of nature, like when it ratchets off into life, it uses these, he said weak forces, like, and again, I better not go into it too much, but the ability to use force and carbon to create this complex molecule that is halfway in between inorganic and organic is the ratchet off into life.
Mm-hmm. Wait, I don't know if I can't remember what I talked about in the videos that you said you watched, so I don't know if I ever mentioned this or not, but there is a very interesting lecture in the McCloskey lecture series by a
Mhm.
guy by the name of Eric Smith, where he's talking about his theories about where life came from.
Mhm.
And one of his theories is that the first life arose where the warm water was coming up through the vents in the ocean floor past certain rocks that had certain chemical attributes and so forth, and that this warm water coming up and all of that created an environment in which life could arise. But in telling the backstory of how we got to that place in the, you know, building of the universe, he talked about how the earth, when it was, I mean, still is, since it's forming, it has a lot of iron on the crust of the earth. And that iron, of course, attracts oxygen.
Mhm.
And so the oxygenated iron
Mhm.
kind of gravitates down to the center of the core, down into the molten core. And then from the molten core, it recirculates back up to the surface through these kind of channels. There are a number of these channels coming up out of the core up to the surface of the earth. And it's where one of those channels of this iron coming back up to the surface is in this warm environment in the ocean, and that's part of what created this environment for life to arise. But what's fascinating to me is, so the whole earth is like this gigantic battery creating the electromagnetic thing because of this iron that's continually moving in and out. And it sounded to me like the earth is breathing, right? That's not just accidental that the earth has to breathe and that the earth breathes.
Yeah.
It takes this oxygen down to the core and brings it back up again, you know, comes back up again for more oxygen so that it keeps, in fact, it's not even just breathing. It's like the circulation of blood in our bodies works that way. It gathers oxygen, and it takes oxygen to the organs, so the organs get properly oxygenated, and then it has to go back, and you know, we breathe, and that oxygen is translated into the blood so it can feed the organs again. So I thought that was amazing. I mean, he didn't say that the earth is breathing or that it's got this circulatory system, but it sounds exactly like that. I think they're hesitant to anthropomorphize things like that because it sounds too much like it's a design.
I think that makes sense. You know, you could certainly look at it on that level, and also what you're describing is that same, you know, is going for more flexibility, going for more complexity, for, you know, to be able to do more things. That's a very complicated system you described. And these inorganic things, you know, in this model that I'm describing, would each, you know, on very small steps would be saying, this feels better, this feels better. And as you do this more, better, 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 this feels like it's freeing up. This feels like, you know, I can combine with more things. And then eventually you get something emergent like that from all these tiny steps towards what's better, towards what's freer, towards what's more flexible. And then you end up with this amazing system.
You don't have any hesitation in using words like feeling when you're talking about inorganic things. That's interesting.
Well, it seems to me that if value is, you know, if value is central, you could say computation. I mean, I would say computation is describing choosing. You could even say, if, you know, if the way Glen's using the word computation, if I understand the way it's using it, it's that this inorganic substance has this sense of what is going to make things better for it. And it's not, you know, it's a very, very low level form of consciousness. But the thing is, this choice of what's better continues all the way up to every single decision we make at every second.
Well, so at its simplest level, the computation he's talking about is just the yes, no question.
Yeah, but there is a yes, no, and yes is better than no. No means, you know, you don't have an opportunity here. Yes means you have an opportunity there.
Well,
and
I mean,
let's just use the word.
Sometimes no is better, sometimes yes is better. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. If it's something you want to avoid, yeah, certainly. But it means, you know, there's your opportunity, which one is going to work better for you. And so a lot of people would say, well, this is just random, there's no choice. But and of course that's a matter of what metaphysics you want to, you want to go with. But what makes more sense to me is this ongoing choice of quality that everything does all the time.
Yeah, I mean, so I had no problem understanding what Glenn meant when he said choice in that discussion with Carl.
Yeah, yeah.
But he got creamed in the comments from using
Yeah,
that word, and of course Carl went after him for using that word.
yeah,
But in my mind, it makes perfect sense.
yeah. And I think that that's what it really comes down to is you can argue it forever, but I think it's a point of view, and this is the point of view that I think that certainly for me, and it seems like for you, makes more sense than random particles bumping together until until they until they create something. That doesn't sound right to me.
Well, even from a perfectly scientific point of view, I think, I mean, and I'm obviously not a scientist, but things randomly bump together until they make something based on a physical law, some constant or some one of the four fundamental forces, or there's something happening that makes something happen. There has to be a precedent. Something precedes something always. And
yeah, exactly like you were saying about all this training to learn art preceded you being able to make these sophisticated unconscious decisions when you're painting.
Well, I've heard this matrix before of perceive, decide, act. I don't remember where I saw it first, but it fits so well with what Carl Friston means when he's talking about the Markov blanket in the arising of the consciousness, and with what Mark Solms is talking about as well. Perceive, decide, act. Perceive would be the sensory part, and then act is the active. So we have the sensory states and the active states, and in between is the decision place, the internal state. So you have sensory, internal, and act. And only the sensory states in our brains are connected to the external world.
Right.
They receive from the external world. We internalize, try to understand what it's all about, and then we act upon the external world. So the active states have the ability to act upon the external world. The sensory states have the ability to draw in the external world to be acted upon.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's perceive, decide, act. Well, that's also, if you think just of quantum states, the quantum waves do not become quantum particles until they're observed. So there has to be some sort of perceiving. When they're observed, there's a decision process of whether to become a particle here or there. There's so many probabilities of where the particle could end up coming out of the wave. And then once that particle is there, it has some sort of active effect on everything else, right?
Yeah.
So where the particle lands, once it's been observed, has some sort of action effect. So it's still this perceive, decide, act, so that matrix seems to go through everything.
Yeah. Yeah. And perceive, decide, act would be the same kind of thing. You have this perception. You could call it unconscious. You could call it pre-intellectual perception of value. It makes itself known to you in a sensory way. And then what are you going to do? And this, again, goes all the way down. What is that is receives this signal? What is it going to do to act on that so that it becomes a pattern, so that it becomes something tangible, so that it becomes the thing that the computational relationship instantiates?
Wow, okay, that's really interesting. I'm gonna have to think about that. Because Glenn is always talking about how algorithms are real,
Mm-hmm.
because an algorithm can instantiate
Mm-hmm.
into a thing like a chip
Mm-hmm.
or a computer. An algorithm can instantiate itself. Well, I mean, with some help, obviously, but an algorithm can be instantiated. So
Mm-hmm.
algorithms are real. Anything that can be instantiated is real.
Mm-hmm.
So you're talking about a value. This value, the value scale is the kind of the decision, the decision about, is this, when I had the conversation with Mark Solms, we talked about, is this good for me or bad for me,
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so that's the value scale that you're always thinking about. Your body says it's too hot right now, it needs
Mm-hmm.
something. So what am I going to do to not be hot? Then I have to decide what's good for me, and that's the internal process, and then I act.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but what part of that were you saying is finding the pattern? Because that was really interesting to me when you said
Mm-hmm.
instantiating the pattern, and I kind of missed your terminology there.
Okay, well, let's just say I'm too hot. What am I going to do about it? And that what you do about it is a pattern of value. It's like taking off your coat, and then you will remember next time to take off your coat. So that becomes a pretty solid pattern that this perception of being too hot and fixing it, let's just say. So any action is a pattern. It may be a good one, or it may be one that isn't so useful.
So it would line up with when you make an action and it doesn't align with reality,
Mm-hmm.
reality being what's good for you,
Yeah,
then you have to adapt your predictive hierarchy
that's right.
so that the next time when you make an action, it will align with reality.
Right. You have created some kind of way of dealing with this perception of quality, high or low. And if it doesn't alleviate, if it doesn't make things better for you, then you're gonna let that one go and try something else the next time. So you're going to go for what you think is better, but it may not be. And if it's not, then you'll try something else. And if it is, you're going to continue with that, and then that pattern itself is going to grow.
So as human beings, what happens to us that we can get so messed up in that decision-making process that make we think we're making a decision that's going to make it better for
Mhm.
us, and we actually make a decision that makes it way worse for us, and then we're unable to see that that's what we're doing, so we
Mhm.
get lost in that space for a long time. What is that?
It's something like the parasitic processing, right? John Vervaeke's parasitic processing, meaning like this should be taking us in the right direction, but something is happening, and we're doing the same process, but it ends up being something that isn't good. I think that let's look at what John Vervaeke says. He's very interested in being in the meditative space in Buddhism and that kind of thing. And I think that one thing that happens, let's just talk on a practical level.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a bunch of preconceptions about the way things are, and you're trying to mold things into your preconceived notion, then the thing you choose to do may not be so good, because it's not based on reality. It's based on an idea, or it's based on some prejudice that you have, or something that you want to be true. So unless you have an in the moment relationship with reality, and that doesn't mean you dismiss everything you've learned and everything like that, but it also means you have to be observing reality as it presents itself to you, not as if you'd like it to present itself to you, or not as if you're too stuck in all this stuff you've learned, if you're too stuck in your static patterns, let's say, and you're not seeing what's in front of you in that meditative, let's just say, in the moment, in the present, these terms that are used in mindfulness all the time, then you might have a difficult time making a choice, because you're not looking at reality as it presents itself to you. You're looking at reality through the lens of too much tea, let's say. So you need to combine, it's exactly what you said, I think, of your painting process. You need to combine all the good things you've learned with where you want the painting, what's happening on the canvas. And it's like you said, if you're trying to make a mechanical representation of something rather than develop the painting as it presents itself to you, then you're going to have something worse than what you were going to do if you're a little bit more flexible in the present, in the flow state.
Well, when you're describing this thing with it, when you get too stuck in your static patterns, that sounds very much like when Ian McGilchrist is talking about how it seems that our brains have changed over the centuries so that we're becoming more and more and more stuck in the left hemisphere, which is causing us to particularize this vision that we have of reality, but it's getting more and more and more atomized rather than getting a broader perspective kind of view of things. Is that a crossover there?
I would say definitely, because I think one thing he said is when you start categorizing things, atomizing things, then you pull the life out of it and you end up with a dead duck. You've defined all the parts, but the parts, defining the parts don't make the whole. There's this other thing that makes the thing whole. This you could call it life. You could call it life, even in even in something that's not alive, like a painting. If you dissect things too much, you pull the life out of it. And the problem is with what we're doing is we're over intellectualizing and categorizing things, and then acting on those intellectual concepts and trying to put them back into something that we can't, because we're neglecting the relationships of the parts.
Yeah, it seems to me there's something there that also leads to, I have a whole lot of things in my head right now, but
Me too.
so the categorizing thing is kind of, in my mind, is connected to the intersectionality thing, which is this ideology that
I think perfect example.
All these identity groups, and so it's very particularized. And there's something inside of that, neglecting the relationships of the parts, that lets go of goodness and truth and beauty. Because the people that I know that are stuck in that spot think that the world is irredeemably ugly and hopeless and painful and nihilistic and incapable of seeing that there is a beautiful side. And I mean, I know some people who are trapped there, it's very much like a mental illness that they can't get out of, because the world looks so hopeless to them that they can't get past that. And so, it's
this is a tough one.
It's one of those big things. So it's the utopian vision, the preconceived notions. Basically, I think what you're saying is any sort of an ideology is an incomplete view of the world.
Yeah, it's purely intellectual. It's enforcing an intellectual construct onto the other levels, and that's where the levels come back in, because you've got things going on at the other levels, the social and the biological level, that the rules of the intellectual can't apply to these levels. You have to take them all into account. So if you take an intellectual construct and try to enforce it onto the social level without paying attention to the social stuff, then it's not going to work. It's a nice idea. You can say, well, it's a really great idea for everything to be equal for everyone. And then you try to enforce that on people. And which onto society, which has these natural hierarchies. And then you try to dismantle these hierarchies with this artificial means without paying attention to the fact that the social level has these hierarchies that have evolved, bottom up. And then it's just, then it's really problematic because they're incongruent. So the only way you can keep them going is to enforce them.
So we could go back, we could take it back down to the level of when Glen was talking about complexity and the inner and the outer, which I think you're relating also to these levels. But his example, very simple example, is that of a watch, that a watch has equal complexity, whether it's a functioning watch or whether it's a watch that's been reduced down to its component parts and is just sitting in a pile. They're both the same complexity. But the watch that is a working, functioning watch is internally complex, but once you get up outside the boundary of that and you get into the outer view of that watch, looking at it, it's very simple to relate to it with by just observing the way the hands move. And you don't need to know anything about the complexity of the inside, right?
Right.
But so if you take that inner and outer thing and think of the social world being the inner, which is very, very complex. Our social relationships are very complex and have arisen over eons and are pretty much baked in. And then you get up outside of that, up to the next level, which is the intellectual level, and you try to impose your view on it and say, oh, well, if it were a watch, I would say, oh, well, I want the hands to move backwards instead of forwards. So if I force that to happen, then all the gears of the watch are just going to go, right?
Yep. Perfect. Yeah.
So it's exactly the same thing.
Exactly the same thing.
That's what was so interesting to me about when Glen was talking about that inner and outer thing. You can see that everywhere.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and you've got this construct, which, you know, like intellectually, it's a really good idea, fairness for everyone. And then that construct says, well, what's been unfair is that this group of people, and then you make a fixed identity, you know, based on a couple of variables, has more than this group. So obviously, the best way is to make sure that this group gets more of the advantages going forward. And it's so simplistic. And these, you know, and then it's saying, well, this thing I've said is a reality, which is this group of people can be characterized this way. It's so simplistic that, you know, it sounds good intellectually, but it's exactly what you said. It's not going to work. You know, you've decided that it's better for everyone that the hands go backward.
Yeah, I wish there were. I really wish there was some way to put together something where we could talk about these things at a mechanical level or at a level that's detached from all the emotional conundrums that come out of these really big issues, and just kind of rationally rationally explain how these things work, especially for the people that I know that are seriously hurting because they're trapped in any ideology, whether it's right or left. I know a lot of people trapped in a lot of ideologies that are in a lot of pain because they can't find a way out of their box. And the only way that they can see to get out of their box is to force somebody else to come into their box and share the same box with them. And yeah, we're headed into some tough times in the world, I think.
Yeah, I hope we can do something about it.
Yeah.
What do you think, like, maybe we should talk about Mark Solms a little bit, since he's more in that era. He sort of, so well, one thing I thought was great is that Solms is so close to both McGilchrist and Panksepp, and he's really close to Panksepp, who I'm just such a big fan of. Have you ever seen Panksepp's tickling the rats?
No, I've heard Jordan Peterson talk about it.
It's so cute. It's the best. So that's how he demonstrates that rats have this play, this essential, which he's got these seven emotions, these seven base emotions. There's a whole lot of models for emotions, but his are based on what the mammal expresses, which is these 7 base emotions. And one of them, you know, is play, which you demonstrate. You've got to see it. It's the best.
Well, he also had the thing about rats that rats have to be reciprocal in their play or they won't
Mhm.
continue playing.
Yeah.
The bigger, larger rat, if he wins all the
Mhm.
time, the little rat won't play with him anymore. So in
Mhm.
order to continue to play, the bigger rat will subsume some of his own strength and
Mhm.
kind of back off so that the little rat gets to win at least 30% of the time.
Mhm.
And I wish I should have brought this video up, but when my older daughter got a puppy like 3 years ago, and it was one of these tiny little dogs. The puppy was about this big.
Mhm.
And we have a pretty large Siberian Husky. And so she
Is
would
he the
bring,
one who didn't drink?
yes, yeah.
Uh-huh.
So she would bring the puppy
Mhm.
over and I would babysit the puppy. And I took a video of the 2 dogs trying to play together the very first time. And the first time they're trying to play together, and of course, you know, when dogs play, it sounds scary because they're
Yeah. Oh,
barking
yeah.
and
Yeah.
nipping
Yeah.
at each other, and you think, oh, they're going to kill each
Mhm.
other, but they're just playing.
Mhm.
And our dog named Junebug, she would try to bat the little thing because the little thing would bat her with his little
Mhm.
paw.
That's so
I
cute.
would come up and bat the little thing. The little thing would fly across the room, and
Uh-huh.
pretty quick, Junebug got the idea this is not going to work. And so she subsumed all her power down to where all she used was her nose.
Mhm.
And she would sit in one place and kind of nose the little thing. The little thing would climb up over her head and then she'd nose it again.
Mhm.
So they would just play this little game. So it was a perfect picture of what Panksepp was talking about.
Mhm. Yeah, because the dog has made a choice to carry on the game, or you know how boring it is to just win, and that play circuit wants to carry on.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I wish we could get to the, you know, when I was talking to Mark Solms, he said, you know, what we're doing here, talking, this is a
Mhm.
kind of play.
Mhm.
But see, that's the way it should be, right? But there's so
Yeah.
much talk nowadays, it isn't. It's I've got to dominate, I've got to win.
Mhm.
And you lose all the joy in the doing and all the joy in the listening to.
Mhm.
Just
Well, wouldn't you say that having to win, like, let's just say that's a satisfying, you know, obviously that's going to be some kind of, you're going to get some kind of gratification out of that. But it seems to me that if we're living in a world that's increasingly atomized, that sort of this is it, you know, this is the, like, that is going for the outcome that is favorable to you in a very rigid way. It's either winning or losing. So if you've got this mode of seeing reality that's very left brain, that is very yes, no, win, lose. So then probably, wouldn't you say then that the predominant positive emotion is winning with a worldview like that?
it's interesting. Because of my own proclivities, I tend to think of the dominant emotion being instant gratification. So I guess winning is a sign of instant gratification.
Right, but well, let's just say, I mean, instant gratification, you know, that feel it, that positive affect, let's just say,
Mm-hmm.
which instant gratification, I think you could say that it's related, it's certainly very similar. But that the thing that inspires positive emotion the most within the context of this culture that is more and more categorizing, atomizing, you know, cutting the life out of things, and becomes more reductionistic, that in that worldview, winning would be where you're more inclined to find an instant gratification rather than in play, rather than, you know, in other ways maybe we used to do things, maybe more nuanced ways, or maybe yeah, I guess that's all I can think of to say about that.
Well, I don't know if it was Panksepp or I'm not sure who it was who did this research, but a few years ago, I um, watched a bunch of videos by a woman who specialized in the neuroscience of eating.
Hmm.
And she talked about some studies they had done with rats where they took a bunch of rats, let's say 100 rats, and they threw them all in a big cage, and they would feed them. And at a certain time, when the rats knew the food was going to come, they'd all rush over to where the food was going to be, and they'd
Mm-hmm.
eat. So then they introduced a secondary characteristic. About 5 minutes before the food came, they would drop a lever into the cage, and then they'd watch and see what would happen. And over time, when the rats kind of got the idea, oh, the lever's going to come down, and then 5 minutes later, the food is going to arrive. When the lever would drop, about a third of the rats would run over to where the food was going to be. And a third of the rats would just kind of wander around aimlessly. And a third of the rats would go over and start nuzzling the lever, loving the lever. And then they did a second study with these rats who are already categorized now. They knew the lever lovers and the food motivated ones. They knew all that. And they checked which ones were addictable. And they had some other study that they could do to figure out which rats are addictable and which ones are not. And I was very surprised to learn that the addictable rats were the ones that ran over and schmoozed the lever. So it's very weird, isn't it?
Yeah, that is weird. What do you make of that?
Well, so what she made of it, and I thought, as she talked about it, I thought that's really true, because I've always struggled with food addictions, and since listening to her, I've had much more success, because I don't want to be those rats in a cage. I don't want to be those rats. But she said it was that there's certain triggers or signals that we kind of fall in love with the signal, and we let that signal rule our lives. So for me, I might have been driving down the freeway and not even thinking about food. But one of the things I used to really like were the McDonald's breakfast biscuits. Just, I don't know why, but they really appealed to me. And they stopped serving them at 10:30 in the morning. So if I would be driving down the road and I would notice it's only 10 o'clock, that wouldn't do that didn't say anything to me. But then I would see the golden arches. It's only 10 o'clock and there's a McDonald's. And I'm not hungry, but there's a McDonald's and it's only 10 o'clock. And the car would just drive itself off the freeway. And I would be there in an instant getting my breakfast biscuit. And that was like the lever. So today I was thinking about that, and I was kind of trying to break it down. And I think what's happening is this, that the lever is like a promise. Something's coming. And the food delivery is like the promise fulfilled. In between there's a promiser, the one that comes and actually provides the food, right? So you have the promise, the promiser, and the promise fulfilled. And the addictable rats are the ones that fall in love with the promise. And I'm still working on this, but I mean, at least in my mind, there's something very deep there.
That's fascinating. I agree with you.
Yeah. So I'm trying to work that out for myself, because it just came to me this morning. I tend to work in these matrices. As much as I try to be right brain and not left brain, I still get myself trapped in these little formats. But anyway, you wanted to talk about Solms.
Well, can I say something about that just real quick that I just thought of? So Peterson, with his the first thing he did was all that alcohol. The first area of research was alcohol addiction. And he said, it's not the substance that you're addicted to, it's the behavior, it's the context. And he said the best way to get over addiction is to not hang out with your buddies that use drugs and put yourself in a totally different situation. Because the actual substance isn't the problem as much as the whole shebang. Do you think there's something with that does that make things, does that fit into what you're trying to figure out?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I'm thinking of that right now in terms of so many people who are isolated because
Hmm.
of COVID, and they've lost the environment of all their friends, even if those were the friends that they were going out and drinking with, and maybe they're even drinking more because they're not able to hang out with their
Yeah.
friends. So I don't know. I don't know if that's the only way to overcome addiction.
Hmm.
I mean, that seems like a pretty narrow band right there. Um, for me, I think the most significant things that help me when I can zone in on it and remember these things are the Vervaeke's thing about reciprocal narrowing,
Hmm. Hmm.
realizing that if I let myself go down that path, my life is going to get narrowed down to just that path, and I won't have any other choices.
Yeah.
Any intellectual pursuits that I might want to follow, or any relationships that I might want to maintain, or any service that I might want to offer, that's all going to evaporate, and everything is going to revolve around that one thing. And that's where I saw the rats in the cage.
Hmm.
They kind of give up on all their relationship with all the other rats. They don't run off and do what the other rats are doing. They just go and they cling to that
Hmm.
lever, because that's their lifeline, is that promise that their needs are going to get met. I mean, maybe it's a lack of abundance thinking. I think a lot of addiction comes out of believing that we live in a scarcity environment
Hmm.
and there's not enough, and I need to get mine, and I need to get it right now. Whether that getting is food or drink or money or sex or um, any other kind of satisfaction, I need to get it right now, and because it's fear driven, there's not going to be enough for me. And if you can turn that around, and I mean, for me, the fundamental reality that I try to inhabit is that God is good.
Hmm.
God is good, therefore, He is given to abundance and generosity.
Hmm.
And I need have no fear about whether or not I'm going to be cared for. So I don't need to be focused on taking care of myself and meeting my own needs that way. Because if I just remember that God is good and I continue to do the next right thing, things are going to be okay.
Hmm.
If I go the other direction, get all filled up with fear, want to do my thing,
Yeah.
eating the apple,
Yeah.
all of a sudden the world narrows down to this,
Hmm.
very particular point where you've lost the beauty of the universal opportunity.
Yeah, opportunity, I think, is the key word there. I think that's what I was trying to say a little bit earlier when I said that you need to be in the moment, seeing things as they are. Because if you've got an idea that this is your only path, let's say you've gone down you've narrowed your perception of opportunities, and then you operate from there, and then you choose the wrong thing. You think it's the highest quality thing within this narrow window, and not seeing all the opportunity available to you.
Mm-hmm.
Like Matthew 7. Just be aware that I am going to offer you quality opportunities, but you need to trust that they'll be there for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I
And
think that
I
makes
think
sense.
that's what really hurts a lot of
Hmm.
people who are trapped in this nihilistic view, is
Hmm.
that they have this perception. It's just a well-worn rut. They can't get
Yeah.
out of that perception. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really tough. And what do you do for someone like that who is absolutely certain? And I think that's another thing, is that people would rather be miserable and certain than embrace uncertainty and all the opportunities it affords.
Oh, wow. That's great. Um, so one of the things that I wanted to talk to Mark Solms about, and
Oh, yeah, sorry.
I tried to get at it several ways with
Hmm.
him, was, how you're talking about narrowing your perception of reality,
Hmm.
and um, you'd rather be miserable and certain, which is part of, you're faced with this infinite field of possibility, and how do you make your way across the field? The postmodernists would say, well, there really isn't any way that you can do that because there's too many choices and, you know, too many categories. It's combinatorial explosion, so it's kind of hopeless. There's no meaning, therefore. Where the person that's narrowed into their perception of reality, they've decided, I'm going to take this path because that one at least is certain. Even if I'm miserable on it, at least I know something. I'm going to go forward that way. And then I'm going to think I know everything I need to know, which is where you run into a lot of trouble. But if you're going to face that field of infinite possibility with a really open heart and mind, and just say, I believe that if I move forward, I can have something good and I can, you know, make a life for myself. What are you going to do? You're still immobilized because there's too many choices. And Peterson says, then you have to find a higher star. You have to look above the horizon and find a higher guiding goal that lets you organize all those perceptions, so that not only organize the perceptions, but it brings into your perceptual field the information that you need in order to achieve the goal that you've chosen. And I couldn't get anything like that out of Mark Solms. I tried 3 different times to ask the question, how do you get up to the next level? But for him, it all came back to the feelings at the brainstem level, which it seemed to me that he was talking about feelings being sensations. And I don't know how he got from sensations to emotion, because to me, when we say feelings, we mean both my sensations that are in my hands and my nose and my ears and all of those are feelings. But we also say, when you also use the word feelings when we're talking about our emotions, it seems to me that those are 2 entirely different categories of consciousness, of perception, and I don't know how he got from one to the other, because he mainly was talking about sensations. I'm too hot, or I'm too cold, or I'm hungry, or I'm sexually aroused, or I feel like I'm suffocating. Those sensations drive this value register. But where does bliss come from, or love, or joy? The value register he's talking about seems to me like a very narrow band. Whatever you do that's going to meet your need, and then that nature's going to select for that, and those that are better at meeting that need are going to get selected for. But then you're just selecting at a very pragmatic level.
Well, if you're looking at emotions through the Panksepp model,
Okay.
The emotions themselves, the 7 emotions, love being one of them. Well, let's just say, if you're looking at it through the Panksepp model, then what Solms is doing is relating feeling. He's saying that we have the same circuits that the animals do, which is true. And I think what you're talking about is something more transcendent. I think the feeling and emotion you're talking about is in context with more on the social level.
Well, let's try to take that apart.
Yeah, let's try, because I think I know what he's talking about, but I'm wondering,
bliss,
what is your definition?
Bliss would always be social. Love would always be social. Joy. I guess it's conceivable that joy could be personal and not social. It's always relational, because maybe your joy is brought about by a radiant sunset, or a beautiful tree, or the bird song, or a beautiful poem, or so it's always always relational in some sense, relational with something.
That
something
makes sense.
Someone.
So I think what he would be talking about, that particular emotion of joy, would be the connection the basic connection is the mother and child in every animal species. Not every animal species, every mammal species, because apparently these egg-laying reptiles don't have this emotion that develops with the mammals. So the understanding of, and maybe play would be in that too, you know, that would be relational. Maybe, like I was saying in the notes, lust kind of is that earlier form of it that turns into this more sophisticated, that branches off into this more sophisticated care, is what Panksepp calls it. And that like, say we're talking about these emergent levels having their own rules. So on the biological level, we share this care emotion, which is this connection with the mother and that relational feeling of positive affect with another being. It manifests as play if it's not the mother. So there's some positive relational thing on that biological level. On the social level, the way we relate to each other is manifest with these emotions, but the social level develops its own version of it. It's not like I don't believe it's like the evolutionary scientists map it one-on-one. They explain away the social level by saying, oh, well, this is just some variation of this primitive instinct, this primitive emotion. Once you get into the social level, you've got the meaning of that social level, you know, the joy of, let's just say if we're talking about bliss on a religious level, you have the sensibility of God, which you get from us being social creatures. I mean, you don't dream up, if you didn't grow up with any kind of culture at all, I don't think you'd come up with the idea of God as a concept. I think that occurs in conjunction with everyone, you know, you have relations with, and that love magnified. I don't want to say God is emergent, because I don't necessarily believe that, but it's one way of explaining it, is saying that love magnified becomes this emergent, you know, socially becomes this higher emergence, like Glen said, above the individuals.
So there's two things there. I need to pull them apart. The first is that one of my earliest childhood memories, and maybe I was 3, I don't know. I did not grow up in a family of faith. There was no church or talk about God or anything like that when I was growing up. In fact, I grew up in a pretty chaotic environment, but one of my earliest memories as a child is maybe 3. And my memory is subsumed with light and a beautiful field or something. I don't really know where I was. I don't know, but absolute certainty that there was a God. So I don't think, for me at least, when I was that age, and of course I went through many years after that when I didn't have that kind of certainty, but I remember that when I was 3 years old, that didn't come out of any teaching or any social environment that I know of. I mean, there may have been some, maybe I had a 3-year-old friend who was all pattering on about God or something. You know, I don't know. I don't recall that at all. I just remember that feeling. And I've talked to other people who had that same experience, where they had a deep feeling when they were very young children that there was, we wouldn't have used the word God, but that there was somebody, some entity that was good and filled with kindness and beauty. Even though my home environment was not that, I had this assurance that there was something that was beautiful and kind and comforting. So I don't know where that comes from. But then when we get to this idea of Glen talking about all the different emergent levels, one of the characteristics of an emergent level, strong emergence, is having top-down causality.
Mm-hmm.
So a simpler explanation, a simpler example than thinking about God would be, my consciousness is a strongly emergent factor of my humanness, and my consciousness has a downward causality upon me, because my consciousness can, tell me that I need to get out of a burning building.
Yeah.
It has an impact on my body. My consciousness can tell me, you need to have more friendships or whatever. Your consciousness is going to have an effect on you as a person. And I start thinking about so many things.
I know, it's
can't stay with one train of thought.
Yeah,
But so
I can't either.
thinking about if a person wanted to look at God as an emergent property, which I don't really want to do that, because God is a person and not a property, but he certainly has a downward causality. So he has, and this is where I think, I had many conversations with Carl, and the problem we would always run into in really trying to communicate with each other is that he has this very interesting view of the world, that there is what Paul Vanderklay calls a God number one, being this moral centerpiece of the universe, and that the universe is constructed around this moral center, but not that is a God who is a person, or a God who has any causality in the universe, or has any impact on people, or is a part of the universe in any way. Just that there's a moral center, and he can call that God number one. And Paul talks about, and of course we would think that is the transcendent God, and then the immanent, or the personal God, is Paul Vanderklay's God number two. And a lot of scientists think that if you're going to talk about a personal God like that, he would need to show up in the world, in the universe, as some particle. He would have to be identifiable, findable, right? But I really like the picture that Jonathan Pajot gives of
me too,
of the hierarchy, with God is the base, and he's also the pinnacle. He's also beyond the pinnacle. I mean, I prefer to think beyond the pinnacle, because I like Chris Wilson's picture of the asymptotic relationship to the axis. So
what does that mean?
Okay, so he fell in love with calculus because he could see this. The asymptote is a certain function, a curve, that comes up and continues to go upward, but never touches the axis. It just gets closer and closer and closer and closer, but it never touches. That's a function of calculus. Maybe using the wrong word. Maybe it's not function. Maybe it's derivative or integral or something. But it's this curve that's always going up and never touching. So if it's never touching, then it can't just be the top of the hierarchy. It has to be above the top of the hierarchy, which makes sense, because if people can get to the top of the hierarchy, they have to have something else to reach up beyond, which is Jordan Peterson's, looking at the star above the horizon. So this God, who is the foundation of everything, is also waiting for us above the top of the hierarchy and having a downward causal effect on the hierarchy. So there's always this continual movement through the universe, continually pouring out love and goodness and generosity and abundance, and helping everybody to kind of rise up. It's kind of a lame picture, but
well, it's like that, I mean, I guess in a graphic it would be that eye that's hovering above, on the dollar. I mean, I don't want to go into that kind of symbolism, but it does make sense. I mean, if you're looking at an ancient symbol, or that transcendent I.
Yeah.
You could
Well,
say.
but some people think of that I being, oh, he's always watching you, just waiting to
Yeah.
strike you dead, you know.
God number one. Yeah.
But but
but
there's a beautiful verse in the Old Testament that the eye of God seeks to and fro upon the earth to see those that he might bless, that he might, you know, that he might offer his goodness and his generosity to.
Right.
And the other side of even the eye that's looking at you to show you when you've gone wrong, that is a blessing and a gift as well. Because if we didn't have this place where when we fail to align with reality, we suffer the consequences. If that never happened, we could never be safe. That's the only thing that keeps us safe, is knowing that when we don't align with the consequences, we have to adapt our perspective. That's our safety net right there.
That's right.
That's not a vicious judge just waiting for you to fail. That is, here's the way. Let me teach you.
Yeah.
When you bump up against this, when that stove is hot, you know, you
Yep.
got to back up, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's, you know, it maps onto Solms homeostasis. It maps onto quality. It maps onto, you know, God being above, always something to reach for. It's just ingrained in the system wherever you look, even as even those inorganic inorganic substances trying to overcome the law of gravity, or the whatever law of entropy down there.
One of the most perfect practical pictures I ever heard was an arborist that I hired one time because we had a tree that was failing in our backyard, and my husband just wanted to go in and whack off the top of the tree and be done with it. And I said, no, I'm going to pay an arborist to come. So the arborist explained to me, you never want to cut off the head of a tree ever, because the head of the tree is what informs the rest of the tree how to grow.
Yeah, interesting.
And if you cut off the head, the branches will come out all wiggy-woggy, and it will no longer, because every tree has a unique shape. You know, an elm has a shape, and an oak has a shape, and a Christmas tree has a shape. That shape is defined by the head of the tree telling the rest of the tree how to grow. And if you cut the head off, the tree can't grow properly. It'll still grow. You know, my husband says, it's a tree, it'll grow. Yeah, it'll grow, but it'll look weird, you know, and as a woman, I want my trees to be beautiful.
I know, I agree with you. But you know what, that's funny. It makes me think that maybe that's what those people who do topiary do. Like they top down, you know, put this system on the tree to make it conform to their preconceived notions of how it should look.
Yeah.
So that's like a left brain, you know, a left brain approach to tree trimming is topiary. I think that's the word. Whereas you're talking about the right brain organic, you know, like using the left brain to clean it up, but as a tool for the right brain, for the essential nature of the tree to flourish.
To have the maximum freedom and flexibility to become all it can be.
Yeah.
And see, that's really interesting because, you know, bonsai wants the natural appearance of the tree, but they want to contain its size.
Yeah.
So with the bonsai, they trim the roots off the bottom so that it can't get too much established into the ground, and then the tree won't grow as large. So that's a different way of forcing your opinion on it. But let's go back to the tree for a second. In thinking about the church, I think, you know, in the scripture, it says that the church is the body of Christ. But the church gets into trouble when it starts to think that it's its own head, because it's not its own head. And likewise, the church gets into trouble. Some churches think that they can cut Jesus off and still have the church. But Jesus is the head of the church. And without the head, the church will not grow properly. All the limbs and pieces and eyes and nose, you know, everything won't be where it's supposed to be if the head isn't there.
That's right.
And I think that's the same picture. And I mean, obviously it's true of our human bodies.
Yeah,
I-
obviously.
And you don't even have to cut off the whole head, but if you just cut out some little part of the
Mhm.
brain that has as its function telling the limbs how to behave, the
Mhm.
limbs will stop behaving properly, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. You have some neurological or a stroke.
And I think this is what the meaning crisis people are talking
Mhm.
about. At least Jordan Peterson is talking about this. If you cut God off and say society can function without God, it's not going to happen.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think we're seeing that. We're seeing all these, um, a lot of this nihilism that we're seeing in some of our friends is because there's been something sold to them that we're just as good as God and we can fix it ourselves.
Or I know a lot of people who say, yeah, maybe there's a God, but if he's there, he's bad. He's evil
Yeah,
to the
look what
core.
happened.
He,
Yeah, yeah,
he stuck us here in this evil situation,
yeah,
and we're stuck here, and we have no choice about it. And
yeah. Yeah,
we
no choice about it.
very
That's
bad
that's
places.
that's really the worst, isn't it? I mean, I think that's a culmination of maybe what we're talking about is choice and the perception of, and you have the choice to see that you have a choice.
Well, so let me ask you, I don't know how Percy would feel about this. I don't know how you would feel about this. Um, One of the quandaries that I get into when I start thinking about this is Jordan Peterson talks about the field of infinite possibility,
Hmm.
and whatever it is that you focus on and move towards, that's going to construct the future, basically. Well, it's
Hmm.
not going to, it's going to construct the past, because you're once you've done it, it's now past.
Hmm.
Okay,
Sure.
so you're constructing your past
Hmm.
is basically what you're doing. And there is a new age idea that um, if you think it, it can happen. So you have all these what do they call them, the posters that have all their hopes and wishes on that they want to come true. What do they
Oh,
call
are you talking about like it's like The Secret? It's like what is that thing called that's so
it? Yeah,
popular?
but I mean, some people have.
Manifesting.
Oh yeah, some
Yeah,
people have
yeah.
these parties where they make up posters of what
Oh,
they want.
affirmations, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, an affirmation
Hmm.
poster. I think there's another word for it, but that's the basic
Yeah.
idea. How does the world actually work? Because it does seem like there's some truth to that,
Hmm.
that that your perception of how the world is
Hmm.
and your actions according to your perception are what create the life that you have. And
Hmm.
if you, I mean, you can say that you believe things, but if your
Hmm.
actions don't align with what you're saying, then that's not really what you believe, but your actions are what are producing the life that you have. So
Hmm.
if your actions align with an idea that, oh, the world is horrible and it's all desperate and
Hmm.
meaningless, pretty much you're going to be laying in your bed and you're not going to be living your life, and then that's your life.
Hmm.
But where do we draw the line between that and manifesting?
Well, I mean, I think that let's just say that manifesting. Let's look at that word opportunity. That if well, the thing about manifesting, it seems to me, is it's frequently for more earthly outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, it's about money.
Mm-hmm.
It's also about relationships. Getting the guy or whatever it is. I don't think affirmations and manifesting in itself, the process, is a bad thing. It just depends on, I mean, this is exactly what Pajot is saying. If you're setting your sights too low or in the wrong direction, maybe you'll get it, but you're really going to be at a much lower level. If you're always setting your sights, if you're always manifesting, because really these affirmations, you could say prayer and affirmation are very related. It's just affirmation is a prayer for something worldly, for something to have, for um, let's just say abundance, in terms of, that's the word they like to use. in terms of money. But a prayer is asking for guidance from the highest good. And as a mechanism, they're probably very similar. I mean, I think these affirmations put you in a space where you probably, you're probably going to be looking for those opportunities to make money. But what if something like a prayer puts you in a space to make the highest quality decisions?
So yeah, and so you're saying that you said something in there that was so important. I lost it. Manifesting is setting your sights too low.
Mm-hmm.
Prayer is seeking guidance from the highest good.
Mm-hmm.
And there was something in between there that popped up in my salience hierarchy, and I lost it.
Was it Peugeot?
It probably had something to do with Peugeot. It had something to do with setting your sights too low.
Mm-hmm. Unworldly?
Well, not just unworldly, but if you're setting your sights too low, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's well, I can't retrieve it. It'll come back maybe while you're talking. Yeah. I get very frustrated, and I'm trying to take notes, and at the same time I'm trying to follow you. Train of thought. But it probably had something to do with the whole process of coming up with affirmations and trying to determine what it is really that is your. Oh, it was going back further. It was thinking about choice in terms of even pre-organic life. Oh, the freedom and flexibility thing. So when freedom and flexibility, we have a tendency to think that more freedom, more flexibility is always good. But that's really not true. There are times when more freedom or more flexibility is actually a negative.
Yeah.
So what does Persig do with that? Because,
well,
for example,
got,
if the body gets too flexible,
mm-hmm.
then you don't have any body strength at all, because
That's
your
right.
joints won't hold together, right?
If you've got your patterns, you've got everything, you've got your static patterns and the ones that work. And you want to preserve the good ones and update them. It's freedom and flexibility, but these patterns protect what's good. They're established there. They're there because they work. And so you don't want to destruct them for the sake of freedom and flexibility, but you don't want to preserve them for the sake of security. It's somewhere in between. If things are too dynamic, too chaotic, that's not good. If things are too rigid, too static, that's bad. So we're looking for that homeostasis. Again, we go back to the same thing that keeps emerging, that homeostasis, that lining up, that harmony. And ultimately, if you are looking at the highest good rather than down here and trying to harmonize with that, that's the best way to be. And I think all of these people are saying that same thing.
Well, so does static and dynamic line up with known and unknown?
I think that's one way you could. Yeah, I think that's certainly one way to put it. I don't know how to answer that question, but
Okay,
there's something in there like that.
Dynamic quality. Because I was trying to look up Persig's idea about static and dynamic quality, and I didn't quite understand what they meant when they talked about the dynamic quality.
Well, he said that static quality is anything you can, static patterns of value are anything that would appear in the dictionary. And they could be anything from the smallest particle to the most grandiose idea. Dynamic is how
defined.
Anything you can find. Dynamic, and there's fleeting ones all the time. People have ideas and thoughts. Those are patterns. They just they're very, very dynamic to the point where they dissipate. or if they're good, you know, people find a way, they write them down. That's a way of making a static pattern out of a dynamic. You know, you get this idea, it's dynamic, and you solidify it by writing it down. For example, dynamic quality is the relational aspect between the perceiver of quality, of the perceiver and the perceived in any situation. You know, what perceives quality and the thing that is perceived as being of quality. That's that relationship. I think computation probably might be a good analogy for dynamic quality.
I think we're getting down to something here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we're seeing things line up.
So perceive, decide, act.
Mm-hmm.
The perceived is outside of that matrix. So perceive, decide, act is if I'm thinking of a living organism,
Mm-hmm.
perceive, decide, act happens within the living organism.
Mm-hmm.
And the living organism is perceiving something.
It comes out of the salience landscape. Like let's talk about relevance realization, which is another good analogy for dynamics, for the mechanism, for the event, for the moment of dynamic quality. It's like what comes out at you, that relationship with what comes out at you.
Yeah, so it's what you're perceiving. It's the perceived.
Mm-hmm. It is the relationship. Yeah.
Relationship between the perceiver and the perceived.
Like it's an event.
So it's the whole event then of something is to be perceived, and then there is the perceiver, decider, actor that is perceiving that thing.
Mm-hmm.
So inside the organism, there's the sensory state, the internal state, and the active state, perceiving the perceived and acting upon the perceived. So there's a relationship going on there.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the four elements of that event.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Like I would say, I mean, it's hard to define, but it's that what is taking you, it's the perception, it's the moment of perception of the thing that is better, or the moment of perception of the better, of the good. And you can see, if you were looking at this, if you're looking at this through a religious lens, that God really figures into this. You could argue that dynamic quality and God are very much related.
Well,
You
so
could argue they're the same thing.
That lines up with the McGilchrist idea about the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere welcomes the right hemisphere makes some sort of a choice as to what let in, but what to let in, but can only let in what presences itself outside of the right hemisphere.
Right.
So it brings in what presences, and then it passes that over to the left hemisphere, and the left hemisphere can only represent. It can't presence.
Yeah. It creates an analog with what's already known. It takes this new information and creates a new pattern and an analog.
So the right hemisphere is seeking, always doing this.
Always seeking. Okay. Everything's always seeking.
What presences. And what presences is always in the, well, not always, in the unknown, what presences itself to the right hemisphere out of the unknown. That's where I think this this connection with God comes up, because God is always making some aspect of himself known to us through this presencing, and that's the relationship that we have with the unknown Jordan Peterson always says, make friends with the unknown rather than the known, because that's where you're going to find the useful, the new information, the quality information is in the unknown. So you're presencing that, it is being presenced to you, you're bringing that in. And it's a gift.
Yeah.
Ian
Right.
McGilchrist says the intuitive mind is a gift, and the rational mind makes an excellent servant.
Exactly. And I think that lines up with everything we're talking about.
So I'm going to think some more about this idea of the dynamic quality and how that lines up with, and I don't know if you've ever looked into Esther Meek. Esther Meek and N.T. Wright both write about this idea of true knowledge being relational, having this relationship with the gift that the unknown is offering. And if you look at it on a phenomenological level, let's say you have a rose bush and your rose bush doesn't look very happy and you want your rose bush to be happier. So you build a relationship with your rose bush. You try something and you observe, is this making it happier or not happier? And as time goes by and you feed the rose bush and you water it and you trim it and you read about things that you can learn about how to take care of a rose bush, the rose bush will tell you what it needs, and you'll be able to, have a relationship with your rose bush.
Right.
You have a relationship with your bicycle when you learn to ride it, and it becomes an implicit, tacit knowledge for you that becomes a part of who you are. And that real knowledge like that is always a gift coming to you that can be incorporated into your being. And that gift, there's something beautiful and loving about that gift. It's a loving presence offered to us.
A loving presence. And that we need to be open and aware to see, to sense that, rather than closed off from that, not believing it's there.
Yeah.
So on that note, maybe we should wind up. We went a little longer than we planned, but that's okay. This was play.
It was just such a delight. Yeah, I hope we get to talk again. I learned a lot from you.
Well, I always learn a lot from you, and I just love what you're doing with your channel.
Thank you. Yeah, now you're on to Lila. So are you done with that? Are you done with Lila yet?
No, I'm only on chapter 18. I'm going kind of slow.
Okay.
It's 32 chapters.
I haven't seen any of the Lila stuff yet because I've been so busy, but I'm going to go back.
It's so hard to do everything I mean, there's just so much good stuff out there.
Well, I don't know how you do it because you're also working full time. So.
Well, I don't do, I would like to do more, maybe one of these days.
Well, much respect, lady.
Well, back at you. All right, Karen, I'll see you next time. Take care. Bye.